Okay. Um, Good afternoon. Welcome to this LandTech webinar on the train station opportunity. For the next hour, we're going to be talking about the draft MPPF, the impact on a transit-oriented development policy and national policy, which is something that's quite common in other parts of the world, but is fairly new for most of the country. We're going to be talking about what it means for finding houses in well-connected places. And we're going to be talking a little bit later on about how LandTech, we have been interpreting that and platforming it within Land Insight. My name is Harry Quartermain. I'm the head of research and insight here at LandTech. I'm going to be joined very shortly by Edward Clarke from Lichfields. First, a few bits of housekeeping. As I said, we've got a lot of people signed up to this webinar today. There's over 300 people, which shows the importance and relevance of this work, which is great to see. Thank you for giving us your time. There's the webinar will be recorded, so if you do lose connectivity, then please do try and rejoin, but we'll send the whole recording out to everybody who signed up after the session. I'm seeing it's echoing. Is that echoing for everybody? Yeah, a lot of echo. Okay. Well, it wasn't echoing before, so let me put the headphones back on and see if that makes a difference. Okay, Glenn, no. Okay, it's fine. All right. Right. So I'm going to assume that most people can hear me because that's coming through on the chat. Right, great, thank you. It's good to get that feedback. As I was saying, there's no the feedback opportunity is via the chat. If you've got questions for the for Ed or me or for Abby later on, please do put them in the chat, and we have a Q&A session towards the end of the call. So, what are we going to talk about today? Firstly, Ed's going to give us an overview of what the draft MPPF actually says. And then we're going to talk a bit about how we at LandTech have interpreted that policy shift, that policy platform, by applying data sets and information we've got access to that policy question to give a best estimation of a good quality answer to that. We're going to do a little bit of a overview of where the opportunity is and what that means for you, for developers, for professionals in the built environment. And then we're going to have a bit of a demo of what that looks like in Land Insight at the end of the session before we do the Q&A. So there is a link in the chat to the white paper. If you haven't seen it already, it's the white paper that we put together at LandTech. So please do have a look at that after you've watched the webinar. But I'm now going to hand over to Ed, and I will be doing the slide clicking in the background. So I'll see you all again in 15 to 20 minutes.
Thanks very much, Harry, and thank you everybody for attending. So yeah, as Harry said, we're going to be going through a bunch of. We can go on to the next slide if that's right, Harry. We're going to talk through today a little bit about, it wouldn't be a CPD without a little bit of marketing. Lichfields are, and a few of our sort of case studies of where we're coming from this. I say it kind of gives us the reason for why we're, the angle from where we're coming from. Also gives a bit of context, and actually it allows us to feedback some of what our clients think and what's important to them. After that, we're going to get onto the policy landscape. So what does this mean in practice? How's it worded in a policy, and what's that going to mean for your kind of schemes? How does which stations come out from this, and what land around it might become available? And finally, we're going to go on to what I'm cheesily calling leaves on the track, which is a few of the kind of elements which might restrict the full potential of this scheme, but we'll also sort of just at the very least provide a little bit of a challenge in some of these areas. So Harry, if we can go on to the next slide. So a little bit about Lichfields first. We are the country's leading independent planning and development consultancy. We've got upwards of 250 staff, around half of which are based in our London office. We're an employee benefit trust, which means that we are independent and going to stay that way. Our residential sort of housing team, essentially, around 20 staff in London, and then we have sort of equivalent kind of staff across the country, which we can draw on. And I'm part of the sort of research team of that. So if we could go on to the next slide. Okay, a little bit about more about what we're doing, who we are, and it's mainly just to say that as well as kind of national coverage, having those offices across the country, we kind of can draw from our experts across these kind of services. I'm not going to try and pitch to you what each and every one of them do, but I think it's quite useful to know that we do things like daylight and sunlight, we do economics, EIA, townscape and heritage, which are all really relevant to these kind of sites. And it means that when we're looking at the NPPF, and specifically this policy, we're looking at it from all those different lenses, and as a company we kind of respond to that sort of wholly. So the next slide, please. A few of our examples. I'm not going to spend much time on this, but just to say that these are real life examples of the kind of schemes that we have done and do and are doing around train stations. So we work with clients like Network Rail and Places for London, promoting their residential mixed-use station kind of work. So got Kier, we're working with as part of Solum at Guildford, Nottingham Genesis at Kidbrooke, and LandTech on the Liberty of Southwark, and then finally the Forthgood Yard in Newcastle with Platform 4 and Network Rail there, which is an exciting scheme as well. And then a few of the other ones, and the reason why we've got these differently is because we also work with developers and property owners on housing, which just gives a slightly different angle. These are kind of build to rent sites, co-living, student accommodation, close stations. We've been working with clients like Pocket Living, Snaresbrook, Mayor Homes at Lewisham, and Realtor at Dylon Riverside, and then a whole mix really of developers for a cluster of separate sites around Hackney Wick Station as well. That's as much of a pitch as I'm going to give you, and then we can get into the real meaty bits. So a little bit about policy landscape. If we go on to the next slide for the detail. So admittedly, I made most of these slides on Monday, and so some of these have already dated a little bit, but we're going to focus today, given the subject, on the NPPF. But you kind of have to see that within the context of the further planning reform that this government have been doing. So they put planning reform at the centre of everything, really, haven't they? So kickstarting house building has been massive. We all know about the 1.5 million homes within this parliament, and we think that's going to stay as a priority under the possible change at number 10. And we know that house building is key to the government's plans for economic growth. This week's announcements, I guess, show how quickly things can change. And it's a rarity for politicians to kind of ignore the potential of planning reform for manifestos. Having said that, as far as we know, this is a relatively stable set of reforms that we're now going through. There's still a lot of bits which have still to come through from the LURA, the Levelling Up Regeneration Act, the Planning Infrastructure Act, and the Devolution Act. They all need loads of secondary legislation to make anything really hold and for things to come through that really matter. Emergency measures to support house building in London, also big set of measures which are coming through. So there's a lot of moving parts, is my point. Yes, but within the NPPF, the government set out 12 policy changes that they thought were the sort of key priorities. There's a whole lot more, but they said 12 kind of bits which structure and run through the kind of golden threads of the NPPF. The NPPF itself, really significant change, probably the most significant since its introduction in 2012. It's now a kind of much more rules-based approach, which gives some clarity and some coherence to it. And when it is published, which we thought was going to be imminently, and is still, it's been committed to being this summer, as far as we know, although the government aren't being clear on what summer means, possibly mid-September, as you can see from Andrew Lansley's LinkedIn post, which I think was yesterday or the day before. But when it does come through, it will apply immediately. And that's really important for kind of the fact that we need to be thinking about this stuff now. And I think Harry will get onto a bit more of the practicalities of that in his presentation. But there's 4 bits which really matter for train station development. Permanent presumption in favour of suitably located development. It's a really big policy that's going to be kind of the driving force behind the NPPF. Establishing in principle support for suitable proposals that develop land around rail stations. That's the key NDMP that's relevant to rail station development, and then driving urban suburban densification and embedding a vision-led approach to transport. All those things will matter. I'm going to be focusing on number 2 there, but it's in the context of those 4 measures. Go to the next slide, please. And actually one more. So next section, the growth of railway stations. So this is kind of the policy, the key bits of the policy landscape which has changed. So it's essentially land at train stations or suitable suitable proposals, and actually sort of eligible railway stations comes into play through 3 different routes. So for land within settlements, there's something that's called S4, which is the kind of standard permanent presumption in favour of suitably located development for kind of built-up areas, essentially. Land outside settlements, and that's the key one that this policy changes, and that's called S5. That's the one we're going to be focusing on mostly today. And then GB7, which is for land in the green belt. Basically, the difference between S5 and GB7, as in whether your land is on a green field or in the green belt, comes down to whether, you know, the actual difference is basically whether it meets the golden rules. So that's the same for development across green belt. And I think Harry's going to pick up a little bit more on the detail of that later. But that's essentially the main difference between those 2. So what does it mean? Well, first of all, it has to be in a productive area. So the economic geography has to be within a top 60 travel to work area. So the station itself has to be within one of the top 60 travel to work areas within the country. A travel to work area is essentially a commuting pattern that's built up originally for academic purposes for basically land where an area where 75% of people live and work within that area. And it's kind of made up of local authorities broadly. And it's a best fit kind of geography, but it is a kind of a best fit. It's not perfect, and it doesn't completely recognise commuting patterns, which does pose some problems for areas on the threshold of some of these measures. But essentially, if you're in an area which is a top 60 travel to work area by GVA, by productivity, then your station should be eligible for this policy if it's well connected. So what does well connected mean? Government has set out in the draft at least that it's 4 trains an hour or 2 in one direction across the daytime. A little bit of grey area there, but essentially we're expecting that comes through in the same way into the final version. From our understanding, it's unlikely that a lot of this will change massively despite the level of consultations which have been and are being processed at the moment. Then what does the land have to do? What do you have to do in your development? For the decision-making side of this, well, that's when the minimum density requirements come into play. Discuss it in a bit more detail in a second, but essentially, land outside settlements, or if it's in the green belt, you have to meet the threshold of 50 dwellings per hectare within the net developable area, which is a quite high figure really for suburban or out of town kind of train stations. Again, Harry will get into some of the detail when he looks at what the tool offers on that side. But it's quite an interesting threshold because in urban areas such as, well, some of the ones that talked about earlier, like Dylon, that's about 120 dwellings per hectare. So within London, within more urban areas, that's quite a low density. Whereas for much of the country, it's more like sort of between 10 and 30 dwellings per hectare near train stations. Existing developments. So that again is it's quite an interesting threshold, which we'll get into in a second. Harry, next station. So what does it unlock? Well, first of all, the first thing to say is this is a very significant kind of NDMP policy really for how much land it's going to bring forward. So potentially upwards of 600,000 homes, land for upwards of 600,000 homes could be unlocked through this policy. but it's quite concentrated in certain regions. So this was some kind of relatively quick analysis we did around the time of the publication. And so there is more detail available from others. So Harry will get into more detail again later. But essentially what you're looking at here is, given the criteria, how many homes per region would you get? And as you can see, the southeast, northwest, and east of England all do quite well out of this policy. So quite a lot of land is unlocked. But in areas such as the southwest or the northeast and East Midlands, and actually really the West Midlands as well, you see much less. And in some of these areas, for instance, the northeast, that's largely to do with the productivity measure, and some of the southwest as well, it's down to the productivity measure. But in other areas, it's to do with how many sort of train stations where they meet the criteria when it comes to frequency is concerned. So the West and the East Midlands don't do so well on that side of things. So again, it's quite interesting to just think about the fact that it's very relevant for some areas, but not all areas equally. And that's why we think that you could adjust the criteria a little bit and get many more homes. So again, we've got a kind of different, whether you tweak one or tweak the other, you're like on the fader of where these criteria go. You could get up to 1.5 million homes if actually you kind of maxed it out to increase the number of travel to work areas and the loosen the kind of definition of well connected. I think what's interesting there is not that we're expecting 1.5 million homes to come through. It's more, it gives the potential for that. It gives more land into the system, and it makes it more flexible and more kind of possible to, so basically more land comes to the system for the market to work through, and in that way adds the kind of the elasticity of the market in that way. So potentially quite significant. At the moment, we're pretty confident that it'll come through in that original guise, which again we think is probably going to miss out for some areas. On the next slide, we'll kind of give more of an impression of where that means. So the grey areas there are the ones where you get a significant amount of land if you expand the criteria. And as you can see, it gives much more of an even geography. And I think that's the kind of key part of this. It's not so much that it just unlocks more land in the same places, but actually it just allows more places to benefit from this policy. Okay, so on to density challenges. I think this is really interesting because, you know, we've had this draft now since December, and so we've all had a good chance to have a look at the details of it. We know that things like reasonable walking distance, the policy says that you know, land around stations means land that is within a reasonable walking distance. The minister has said that there's a working assumption of 800 metres. He very deliberately used that, referred to an oral statement where he said that in Parliament, and therefore it comes with a certain weight that is the kind of working definition of what a reasonable walking distance could be. But we think the fact that it is a bit more flexible, it's not an 800-metre hard buffer, it's much more of a kind of a term which is given planning that kind of ambiguity that we love in planning. And actually, I think it does actually matter that it's reasonable walking distance or connectivity rather than just 800 metres. And that's because in planning terms, or in real terms, really, in the kind of lived terms, there's quite a difference between 800 metres on a kind of flat street lit path compared to where there's a hill there. You know, how commodious is that linkage? And actually, it incentivizes developers to really work on a better connection to a railway station, and can improve that. So if you make it more attractive to cycle users or to other sustainable uses, then that could be really helpful. And the government's connectivity tool do a bit of the work on that. And then finally on that, I think it's a real useful reminder of something that quite surprised me, that 3/4 of rail users currently live more than 10-minute walk from their station. So a 10-minute walk, a 15-minute walk, it's not the only barometer of whether someone is likely to use it. It's not the only barometer of an accessible, sustainable location for residential sites. Next slide, please. So achieving appropriate densities. I think this is like really the key bit. So We talked already about the fact that development proposals should be 40 dph minimum in built-up areas and, within settlement boundaries, and 50 for development close to well-connected stations anywhere, whether that's outside or inside settlement boundaries. And we think, our clients are saying to us that stations outside of settlement boundaries, it could be and is in many areas at odds with local character, sometimes with design standards as well, and often with viability for local market conditions to build at those kind of densities. We know that the government want to be disruptive with this. We know they want to be ambitious with this. But the wording does open up the kind of possibility of delivering much higher densities than previous iterations. But it is a challenge, basically. Some urban areas are significantly above 50. We already talked about the dialogue scheme. But for most residential areas near most of these stations, our analysis is that it's much closer to 10 to 30 dwelling per hectares for most areas. So it's a significant challenge. Will the market really want to deliver sort of multi-story flatted schemes in a lot of these areas? Possibly, but it will be a difficult one to sell, both as far as the existing character, but also to the actual potential house buyers themselves as well. Go on to the next slide, please. So we did a little bit of analysis around, this is for Greater Manchester. So the bottom one is the kind of context bit with Manchester in the centre, and then the top one is for the northwest of the GMCA area. Nationally, around 1 in 8 stations with sufficient service frequency and meets the productivity criteria have existing residential development above 40 dwelling per hectare. So only 1 in 8. So again, coming back to that, it could be at odds with local character. We think that's very much the case for a lot of these areas. For pretty much most of these stations, apart from those in the denser areas. In Greater Manchester, for those 52 stations outside of the city centre, we found that 26, so about half, have at least some residential areas of above 40 dwellings per hectare, and then around 15 of the 52 had at least some residential areas which were up to 50 dwellings per hectare, and that's all within 800 metres. So there is some precedent in some of these stations for that kind of density, but it's definitely not the norm. Like, I think the average is much closer to I think it's less than 10 dwellings per hectare for most of those suburban stations. So it's definitely not the kind of existing area. It would be much higher density than is the average, but there is some precedent for some of it in some of those areas. If you go to the next slide, please. So just to sort of finalise on that last point. So on the density, there is a little bit of a trade-off there, where do we go for higher densities where we can kind of get the maximum amount of homes on the sites which are unlocked and are viable, or do we go for the maximum amount of land and deliver the most amount of houses and be much more flexible? Elsewhere in the NPPF, it talks about achieving higher densities in different ways. So but the phrasing is not a flat figure like it is in this NDMP, around 50 or 40 dwellings per hectare. I think it's a really significant difference between this policy and elsewhere. It's not about making best use of land. It's not about increasing the existing density per se. It's much more strict on that. And I think there's a recognition from the government that comes with sort of the benefit of allowing for less local interpretation, where it could possibly be watered down by certain local authorities or in certain decisions setting case law. So that's weighing in favour of the government's decisions to do 50 dwellings per hectare. The weakness of it means that in some areas it's going to be basically unviable to develop at that kind of density, where it won't meet the kind of local character and won't be supported by local people. So that's the trade-off there. I guess just kind of finalising, Switching on the presumption in favour for stations outside settlements is a potential game changer for some sites. So we do think it's a really significant policy. And we talked a little bit about the fact that the frequency trap, some stations aren't going to meet the frequency criteria, despite the fact that further development could provide more or enough of a kind of residential population to increase the frequency. So that's what we kind of termed a frequency trap. It's also a density and viability trap, which I think I've gone through in quite a lot of detail. And they could partly dampen the impact of the policy. I guess the key questions for us when it comes to how the final NPPF will come out: will the reasonable walking distance stay, or will it be sort of a harder 800 meters? We're hoping that it will stay, or at least there's some sort of recognition. It would be helpful to have some sort of recognition that's not just walking. Will travel to work areas stay as the definition of a productive area, and will it stay at its current threshold? Not sure. We think so, but we're not sure. How about frequencies? Will they stay the same? Again, that will be one to look out for, because that's going to potentially unlock. There's a lot of stations at the threshold there of the four departures in an hour. There's actually a surprising amount within that. And I think a little bit more about a kind of how they're really going to measure that, whether that's current or whether it's projected as well, is helpful, and how much Network Rail will help with that will be important. And then will the minimum densities stay as they are? We think that's potentially quite a big handbrake on the potential of this proposal. Excuse me. And that's it from me.
Thank you, Ed. Fascinating stuff. We're going to welcome you back for the Q&A in 15 minutes time or so, if that's all right. So thank you for your remarks so far, and we'll see you again in a few minutes. So I'm going to quickly pick up on some of the threads that Ed has kindly left there for me to pull on over the next couple of slides, and then I'm going to and we'll hand on to Abby for a bit of a show and tell. But first, I'm going to talk a bit about NDMPs. Ed mentioned that this is a significant change. He mentioned that the change in the format of the NPPF. But why is it different? So first NPPF is released in 2012. So for the last nearly 15 years, it's been consistently formatted. As planners have gladly sat there with a tracked change version every time the an alteration has been made, looking at changes to paragraph numbers and changes to wording here and there. When this one came out, it was a clean slate. It was actual decision-making policies embedded in a national policy. Now there was a bit of lack of certainty at some point until Minister Pennycook ironed that out earlier this year about whether these would carry a statutory weight, and that's been answered. And they won't carry a statutory weight, so the planning system will still be hung off the primacy of the local plan. However, currently we have a situation where, according to our analysis of the age of local plans and where the presumption in favour already applies, 80% of the country doesn't have a local plan that they can reliably lean upon, because either through lack of housing delivery, lack of housing land supply, or age of local plan. So in those situations, the fact that there are now decision-making policies in a national policy document is significant. So we are waiting for the final version of this draft policy to be released, so that we can so a lot of these areas of the country that don't have a reliable local plan can have some kind of decision-making policies to lean on. I was also going to pull on the thread of the delivery. Ed mentioned the density requirements, which we're going to come on to in a minute, but also the golden rules. So for any station site within the green belt, which, if you recall Ed's map about where all these sites were, is a good chunk of them. If you're bringing forward a major development in the green belt, you're going to be required to meet the golden rules. Now, anyone who's been looking at grey belt, this is not a new concept. It's the same golden rules that are applying to grey belt. It's the improvements to green spaces, improvements to infrastructure, it's improvements to affordable housing, a high level of affordable housing delivered on those sites. Now, obviously, when you're looking for sites, those are things that we can't tell you if those are going to be achievable on those sites. That's a viability question, but something that's really important to bear in mind if you're looking at sites within the greenbelt that will be relying on that specific policy that applies to sites around train stations in the greenbelt. I'm not going to dwell more on the density here because our friends at Block Type have provided us a couple of examples of what 50 dwellings a hectare might look like. Now, I think context is very important here. Not taking anything away from what Ed said in his remarks about the acceptability of housing at 50 dwellings a hectare. If you look at international context, that's not very dense, particularly in well-connected areas around one of the biggest cities in Europe. So I put these images up because actually I wanted to show you that even at 56 dwellings a hectare, that doesn't have to be the mid-rise, high-rise kind of typology that might spring to mind. Even I'd go so far as to say things like this, which are 72 dwellings a hectare, 144 dwellings a hectare, with the right scale and the right layout. In some places, surely this kind of stuff around well-connected train stations around London shouldn't be beyond the realm of an argument to deliver. So I think that the density question that Ed's laid out there is real for sure, and I completely agree that having an actual target figure in the policy is something new. But I'm quite a big fan of a rules-based system. I think the more certainty you can have in there, the more likely it is that people are going to be able to deliver that certainty. So, notwithstanding the fact that 50 dwellings a hectare around a leafy country village might be a little bit jarring, actually, maybe that's the right outcome. I'm being deliberately provocative with that, but I think that actually that's maybe something we need. I'm going to go on now and talk a bit about how we approach this question at LandTech. So when the draft policy came out in December, I mean, one of the reasons that Ed's here today is because they were impressively fast at getting their analysis out. It was out the next day, which is incredible because I know how much work goes into looking at this stuff, and the fact that Lichfields got their stuff out in 24 hours is mind-boggling. But we went through the same process, or a very similar process to Ed's team, to look at the where the stations are, how to assess connectivity to those stations, what land is associated with those roads that are coming off those well-connected stations, and also how existing constraints. If you think back to Greybelt and its referencing in the current MPPF of footnote 7 constraints, how those showstopper constraints apply to sites that might be surrounding those well-connected railway stations. So I'm going to very briefly run through our process that we worked on internally, how we got to the stage we were able to show you this in Land Insight. So we started off with the drawing on a data set we didn't until that point have in Land Insight, which is the train timetables. So we looked at the train timetables for the whole country and looked at which stations are going to be able to hit the connectivity mark. So we now know for every station in the country how many of them hit 2 trains an hour and how many of them hit 4 trains in the daytime during the time that's outlined in the draft MPPF. We're also able to look at those TTWA areas and identify those train stations that are within those areas. So we can, from that starting point, basically look at where the most well-connected stations are and the ones that are picked up by the policy wording in this draft policy. Now, the walking catchment modelling, the well-connectedness of a site to a station, as I've mentioned, this isn't a binary 800-meter circle. What we did instead is we took a walking route. So we had a model that was able to start as a starting point at the station and look at 800 meters down every walking route from that station, and that gives you effectively an isochrone of which areas are potentially within 800 meters of a station. And as you can see from this image here, it's not a circle. The difference, it allows us to actually identify sites that might be further on the edge of that, but it also allows us to rule out sites that are, as this area on the right of this red circle here are, they're within the 800 meters, but they're not walkable within that time. So it really allows a much more dynamic and locally responsive approach to what is accessible, well connected within 800 meters. The next stage on our process was to look at what land parcels are accessible from that 800 meter isochrone. Obviously, as ever at this stage in a policy development, the PPG and the interpretation of that is yet to come. But we've taken as a starting point any land parcel that is accessible from any site, any one of the roads we've identified. Obviously, it will hopefully come out in guidance at some point as to how that should be interpreted. But this is our starting point for now. So this gives us effectively a set of sites that are accessible from a road that is within 800 meters of a well-connected train station. We were then able to take the land parcels that we've identified and by triaging, screening out showstopper constraints. So things like flood zone 3, things like BMV, best and most versatile agricultural land, certain particular land uses like reservoirs or things that we know are not going to be a housing site. We can crop them out and remove them from the land we've suggested. What that ends up with is around every train station we have a list of sites that have not got significant constraints on them. Where there are other constraints that aren't significant, we know what they are and they're listed. Where a site might be partially, constrained, so for example, it might be half flood zone, we can crop that out and we can say, well, this half of the site is going to be okay, but that half is not. And we can, because of the density targets in the NPPF, we can project how many houses may be possible on that site. Abby in a minute is going to come on and show how this has manifested itself with Inside Land Insight. But before she does that, I'm going to quickly outline what the numbers are that have come out from this exercise. Now, I'm not going to labour this point here because all these numbers have come from the white paper, and the white paper link is still in the chat. So if you do want to drill into this, have a look at the numbers in the white paper. But effectively, we've come up with just over 450,000 homes, which is just around the well-connected, so 4 trains an hour stations. The spread of these is very similar to the chart that Ed showed, very heavily weighted towards the southeast because of the nature of where the train stations are. So these are two particular stations in one of the best well-connected areas around Nebworth and around Stratford-on-Avon. 11,500 homes around Stratford-on-Avon, 31,000 homes around Nebworth. Those are big numbers. I mean, in areas that are struggling to meet their housing need and struggling to adapt to the changing planning system, this is a big impact. Particularly, as I said, this stuff will apply from the moment the NPPF is published. This isn't a strategic planning exercise where these sites might be considered for allocation as part of an strategic planning exercise or as part of a new local plan. These are sites that will effectively be possible speculative development sites from the moment this is published. If you believe Andrew Lansley, that could be September onwards. So getting access to where these sites are and getting a head start on how to assess them and getting your teams together to put in applications for a lot of these sites is a now problem and not a later problem. So I am going to hand over to Abby now, and I am going to turn my mic off.
Thank you. And could you also stop sharing your screen, please, if that's okay? Well, thank you very much. Thanks, Ed, and thanks, Harry, and hello, everybody. So in this section, I'm just going to run you through how this kind of manifests within Land Insight itself. So this data set is an in-house data set built by Harry and also Jonathan, our senior data analyst, that takes into account all of that analysis that Harry's just spoken to, and kind of maps it out in the system for us. So if you're not familiar with Land Insight, this is what Land Insight looks like. So on the very left-hand side, you've got your different data sets and different data bundles. So this sits under your strategic data set. So you've got MPPF station connectedness here. Alternatively, at the top, you can just pop in MPPF station connectedness up here. And then once I toggle that on, you'll see the map appears with a couple of different colors. So we've obviously got the green and the orange. If I click into that left-hand side a little bit more, you'll be able to see kind of the definitions of those here. So if you select the eye icons, it gives you the definitions. So anything that's green is deemed well connected. So there's greater than 4 services per hour during peak times. And anything that's highlighted in orange is less connected. So between 2 to 4 services per hour during peak times in either direction. So if I give you an example here, if I select this site, on the very right-hand side, we're going to click into that and it's going to tell us here, okay, we already know this is well connected because it's highlighted in green, and that's because we've got an average of 4 trains per hour. And then, as has been mentioned, there's obviously the push for high density development in these areas. So this site essentially is 22 hectares large. So then we've kind of multiplied that and brought together this predicted potential dwelling capacity here. So about 1,100. So that's an example of a well-connected railway station. And then if I click into something that's orange over here, so we've got a less connected station. As you can see here, there's 2 trains per hour. And then once again, we've calculated the total hectares and potential dwellings in those areas too. As Harry has mentioned, there are multiple things that kind of went into the creation of this data set. So obviously I'm just showing here the sort of green and the more well-connected and less connected areas, but we've taken into consideration a number of key constraints into this as well. So if I go ahead and I pop in my flood zones data set, you'll see this site here, if I turn it off again quickly, it's got a bit of a jaggedy edge. It doesn't quite map out to the title boundary itself. So if I go ahead and press the flood zones, you'll see that that's been cropped out specifically because there's flood zones that cross this section of the site. So flood zones is one of the key points. And then we've also got protected areas that are part of this as well. So none of the green or orange sites you see across the map that are well or less connected will have flood zones, protected areas, or any best and most versatile. So grade 1, 2, and 3A. That's all been clipped out in Jonathan and Harry's analysis, which is brilliant. So I'm going to show you an example of that's how you can kind of visualize it on the map, but there's a couple of different ways that you can apply the data as well. So if I come into my site sourcing tool on the very left-hand side, what I might want to do here is select the council that I'm in. So I'm around Runnymede and Elmbridge. And I'm going to geofence around those specific areas. And then I'm going to come in and I'm going to add the MPPF filter in. So I'm going to say specifically, I just want to know about the well-connected areas in Elmbridge and Runnymede. So go ahead and apply that. And what our sourcing tool is telling you here is within those 2 councils, we've got 47 results of titles that kind of match that criteria. So you've got a list of them on your left-hand side. They're appearing here. So we've got 47 that we can then work through. We could save them. We can save them into our site's pipeline, come back to them and do our further due diligence on them. So for example, if I select this site's going to pop up specifically on the map. And then on the right, I can go through that right-hand assessment panel so I can do my further due diligence. So I already know it's a well-connected station, well-connected area, because that's what the sourcing tool has filtered out for me. And now it's my chance to do the due diligence on who the owner is. And in this case, it's a private owner. So we could then go ahead and purchase the title, find out who owns it. We can go through any historic planning history, if there is any on the site, any additional policies that cover this site. whether that be sort of here we've got conservation areas or green belt, and we've got environmental information, your comps and local information. So if there's any comparable evidence on this site, we would list that out for you here. And then you'd also be able to go through your demographics in the area too, and power and utilities, because it's obviously important to know if this is going to be a potential opportunity for you where you can hook up to power. As an example, if I go back to one of the well-connected spots here, we'll see Greenbelt is listed. So that effectively means that in those areas the golden rules apply. So as Harry mentioned, the green infrastructure, 50% affordable housing, all of that still applies in these areas. So yeah, we've kind of listed that out for you on the right-hand side when you click into that site. What you can also do within Land Insight is you can create planning alerts for these types of sites. So say we've got a site, this title underneath here we're interested in. If I go ahead and turn on my ownership boundaries, and then I'll just toggle this off, I can select this site and then I can save it, and that can then enter kind of my workflow up in my sites pipeline. And then what I'll do is I can go to the site in my sites pipeline. And I can go here and I can set up a planning alert. So that means that I can then be notified of any new planning applications that come forward for this site. I'll be notified by email of that. And then you can just kind of keep in the loop of everything that's going on with that particular site. So if I show you an example, you can create the alert to either the planning, the site boundary or a radius around that site. So totally up to you how you might want to do that. And then you can just pop in here your various search terms. So if you specifically want to be notified of residential, maybe you're a housing association and you want to be notified of any S106 applications that come through. So you can then fulfill the S106 on that site, and then you can just give it a name here. And then I'll just say title SY. I won't fill it all out. But yeah, so then I can effectively save that and be signed up for applications or notifications of planning applications that match that criteria for me. So that's a quick run through, a bit of a whistle-stop tour. If anybody wants to go through it in any more detail, just let your CSM know, because we'll be more than happy to jump on a call with you. But yeah, thank you to Harry and Jonathan for building out this data set. And yeah, any questions, just let me know.
Thanks, Abby.
It's okay.
It's great to see the stuff we've done in the wild. So I'm going to just reiterate what Abby said there. If you're already a Land Insight user, you can get hold of this stuff. It's in under the strategic land layer. If you're not, then get in touch with one of the team. Yeah, so Ed, would you like to come back online? I have been sent a list of questions, which I'm just reading now. Right, so I haven't got any names for who they are from. So if you've asked a question and you and recognize it, please give us a little clapping emoji or however you want to express your glee. I'm going to Ed, question for you. So the report, being within 800 meters of a qualifying station, what does a realistic promotion timeline look like for a site that is within the green belt that benefits from this? I guess it's the question about when they're asking you to use your crystal ball, I think, about when the policy is going to get published.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very good question, and it's a hot question, and it's one that we have asked many times with usually a flat bat or straight bat answer, I should say, from MHLG. So I think that the government target is still to publish the final version this summer. And I think the key will come down to, I'm sure you all saw that this week when the Prime Minister and Andy Burnham had their conversation, I think it was last week, was it? No, it was this week. Things moved so fast. Saying that there would be no major policy changes before change number 10. I think most people would say this is significant. I think if he didn't come before then presumably the Prime Minister would want a new Prime Minister might want to have a read through and to have a check through. Officially, though, the answer is still that it would be this summer. I think Andrew Lansley's LinkedIn post referred to by mid-September, because I think that's the kind of terminology of the summer within the department. So we'll see.
Great. Another question that's come in is the intention to apply the golden rules in Greenbelt to non-residential development?
That's a good question. So I think I'm just trying to dig out my memory. So I mean, this NDMP is for residential development, but they're sorry.
Residential or mixed use, I think.
Yes, sorry. Yeah, you should say absolutely right. Or mixed use, and therefore for the mixed use sites, you would have thought it would have to meet the golden rules in that way with 50% affordable housing and things like that. But for commercial development, I believe it's a separate route, and you wouldn't be going through this particular kind of element of it. So you wouldn't get like your S5s, if you know what I mean. So it wouldn't be this one.
Yeah, that's my understanding too. And particularly, if you apply the golden rules and look at where they've come from Greybelt, this mechanism doesn't suit that well for non-residential, because the demonstrable need for residential obviously comes. It's quite easy to demonstrate from the housing delivery test or the housing land supply, whereas for commercial development or industrial development, there's another mechanism that's been seen in some of the appeal cases, I think.
That's right. So I mean, there are obviously, sorry, not obviously, but there are lots of non-resi kind of grey belt developments, and as you say, the proving need is a kind of hot topic on this, and actually it's still kind of working itself through case law and things like that. There's a bit of a principle that if it's set as a IS8 industry, so if it's one of the industrial strategy priority areas, then that in itself has been identified by the government as having a critical national need for that. And therefore, there's some sort of context there given for it, but it does depend on what it is. And actually, that's quite helpful, because if you think about the practicalities of having to define in an NPPF about how to define need for employment land, it can get quite restrictive, I think, if it goes down that
route. There's two questions here about where the 800 meters is judged from. Is it the nearest edge or the centre or the furthest residential point? Two people have asked that same question. I outlined our approach to that. What's your opinion, Ed?
Yeah, I mean, we've got two ones. We've got the technical point so within our, as you say, sort of not quick and dirty, but relatively swift kind of analysis, we basically used it as a buffer, and therefore we said any sites, any land within that, and then applied it. So we weren't quite as fastidious about picking out sites as you were. So that's where you get your kind of finer grained detail. But from a planning point of view, I think it's a really good point, and it's one that hasn't been clarified at all in the draft, and it's something that is a question in the consultation. They kind of get to this, like how would you define it, which bits. And I think the honest answer is that we don't know yet. So it will come through either in the full version of the NPPF or in guidance associated with it. But it's definitely something that the government are aware of, not least because some of our reps that we help clients with asked the very same question, or at least suggested some things around it. So I think the key bits with that will be, I'm pretty sure that 800 meters will start at the entrance to the station. But as far as the other side of things, so where it comes to the kind of the site boundaries, will be really interesting. Important to note that also train station boundaries, the actual land associated with the train station and the curtilage around it can be really significant, really quite a big site. So the terminology of that will be really important.
Yeah, thanks, Ed. There's one question which I've seen on here, which I'm going to ask, because it's got a fairly short answer. Then there's a question that might have a longer answer. One question is, can you see the isochrone layer on Land Insight? And The answer is not directly, but you can see the impact of it from where the sites lay. So that the ice crown layer of where the 800 meter down the roads is isn't visible, but the sites are. So a question here from James Cross, which is interesting. I've had this debate separately myself. So this question is: I believe the MPPF sets out the well-connected trains definition that these stations must be reasonable expectation of satisfying the criteria in the future. Have you considered what stations may be defined as well-connected going forwards? So it goes on to say, similar question: the 800 meter ice crown precludes sites that could deliver new access links in the future in line with the 800 meter distance. Any clarification? So the second part of that is we've in our analysis have not been able to assess future links because we don't have visibility on that. But if you were making an argument that a site could be made accessible, that's definitely picked up in the policy as far as I can see. The question about reasonable expectation of satisfying the criteria in the future is an interesting one, I think, because if you've got a train line that doesn't currently meet the connectivity, but that train line is augmented, improved, and suddenly it does, then it doesn't just hit one station, it hits all the stations on that train line. So there's a potential cascade effect there, which could come if the improvements to train services roll out. Have you thought about that, Ed?
We did in the blog, but I don't think we sort of expressed it quite in the same way. But I think it's really important. I think I'm understanding the question right. It's a really important point, the fact that if you're going to build a development of sort of 3,000 homes, then that comes with a significant increase in the population for that area. It also comes with likely, start to get local services with that, schools or local shops and things like that. And you start to get a different, first of all, dynamic to wherever that settlement is, but also as a kind of a magnet for people and for travel. And therefore, it could support more frequencies. And we think that it's something that's perhaps underplayed in the MPPF is the capability of a site unlocking greater frequency on a train station. So at the moment, the way we read it, we don't think it does really make enough of that as a kind of an impact of a development, increasing frequencies and allowing for that in it. So that's one thing. Although there is a bit within it which talks about working with the network operator to allow for planned upgrades. But we think that's quite a high bar. If working with Network Rail at the best of times, wonderful as it is, can be quite challenging in getting responses as a statutory consultee on existing lines, existing services. Getting that as a sort of commitment to a proposed, upgrade when you haven't even got planning permission on the site is going to be quite a high bar. So it will help in some areas where it's already going to happen, like et cetera, but you wouldn't be able to go to Network Rail and say, I've got a piece of land. We think it's significant enough that you'd be able to open up a station in time. Can I get your commitment? We think that's quite a high bar for this.
I would definitely agree. The last question I'm going to ask is about Harold has talked about building houses, but many locations will want build to rent, and also access to power will be crucial. And there's another question from Alexander that's talked about access to infrastructure. The infrastructure stuff is, I think, interesting, in particular, well, for greenbelt sites that's covered in the golden rules, I think to some extent. But have you seen any expectation on tenure?
Good question. No, I mean, I think, to be honest, it's still early doors in the fact that no one's been able to use the policy. It's not in place yet. It's more of a consideration. So I haven't heard anything on tenure. I mean, I guess the greenbelt, as you say, when it comes to golden rules through the GB7 kind of route, you'd have to deal with tenure on that. But no, when it comes to the living sector, I don't think I've seen anything about how that be considered. I'm assuming that in urban areas where you would expect to meet higher than 50 dwellings per hectare, that would be just part of the housing mix. I don't think it would be anything explicit for or against that beyond what a local plan kind of setting would be. So no, I'm not sure that I have seen anything specific on it. It's a good question though.
Yeah, great. All right. Look, well, we're on the hour, and I did promise a hard stop. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Ed, for giving us your time. Thank you, Abby, for giving us your demo. Thank you, everyone, for coming along on the hottest day of the year. I hope everyone is staying cooler than I've been able to here with my little fan. Thank you all, and we'll see you all next time.
Thanks, Harry. Thanks all.
Thank you.